You've slowed down this company's development for years. I should have fired you sooner.
Then explain why everything still works thanks to me. You're confusing silence with absence.
Effective immediately. You're no longer with this company. The sentence landed flat, almost bored, delivered by a man who enjoyed how quiet the room became afterward. No explanation followed, no discussion. The CEO leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes moving slowly around the table as if daring anyone to question him. I stayed seated for a moment, absorbing the performance. I'm Robin Stewart. For over a decade, I ran strategic operations, the unglamorous work that kept revenue predictable and crises invisible. I built systems people trusted and decisions others relied on. Employees knew my name long before they knew his. The CEO was new, ambitious, loud about speed and decisiveness. He liked quick wins, bold gestures, and public dominance. To him, I wasn't experience, I was friction. He repeated himself, sharper this time. Turn in your badge. Security will walk you out. No one intervened, not the CFO who had approved my plans for years, not the board members who nodded along to my reports. They stared at their laptops, their notes, anywhere but me. Silence became agreement. I removed my badge and placed it on the table. My hands were steady, even though my chest felt compressed, like something vital had been pushed aside without warning. Being dismissed wasn't the insult. Being erased was... As I stood, the CEO smiled, satisfied. Already moving on to his next agenda item, I was no longer part of the conversation. That was the point. I took 2 steps toward the door, then paused. On the wall, framed and largely ignored, hung the company charter. Most people treated it as decoration. I'd helped write parts of it. I turned back, just long enough to look at it again. Then I smiled, very slightly. It wasn't relief. It wasn't victory. It was recognition, sharp and quiet, that this room had made a mistake it couldn't reverse. I said nothing, because silence, in moments like this, carries far more weight than protest ever could. They watched me leave, unaware they had just recorded the beginning of their own unraveling, without realizing it yet. Take a quick second with me here. How are you holding up today? Maybe grab a small healthy snack, something light like a piece of fruit or a handful of nuts, just to take care of yourself before we keep going. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? If stories like this resonate with you, subscribing quietly helps me keep telling them, and it means more than you think. Now, let's get back to what happened next, because the silence in that room didn't last very long. They erased my name before they erased my access. The email arrived less than 10 minutes after I left the boardroom. It came from the CEO, sent to every employee, every partner, every address that mattered. He thanked me for my past efforts, then explained my departure as a necessary correction. According to him, progress had been stalled, decisions delayed, leadership lacking. He didn't just remove me, he rewrote me. I stood at my desk while notifications kept pinging. Each one another small lie. Projects I had designed were suddenly described as team initiatives. Crises I had absorbed were framed as lucky timing. My role was reduced to something expendable, something temporary, something anyone could have done. The injustice pressed down hard enough to make my jaw ache. HR arrived without eye contact. My system access vanished line by line email, dashboards, internal tools I had helped choose and build. A security guard hovered too close, pretending not to watch my hands. No one asked questions. Procedure moved faster than truth ever did. As they waited, memories cut in sharply. I remembered the quarter when cash nearly ran out, and I negotiated a restructuring that kept us alive. I remembered sleeping in the office during a systems failure, directing teams until dawn. I remembered steadying investors when the CEO everyone now admired was nowhere to be found. Those moments had built this company. Now they were being edited out. The contrast became impossible to ignore. The man calling himself decisive had inherited stability, not created it. He spoke loudly in meetings, claimed ownership of outcomes, and avoided responsibility when numbers dipped. I had been the quiet constant. He was the headline. I packed slowly, refusing to give them the satisfaction of urgency. Coworkers glanced up, then away. Unsure whether sympathy was permitted, the email had already taught them what to think. Silence. Once again. Did the work at the door. The CFO met my eyes. He didn't follow HR's script. He leaned in just enough for no one else to hear and spoke under his breath. "This doesn't look authorized." That single sentence cut through the humiliation like a blade. I nodded, said nothing, and stepped into the hallway, knowing the company had erased my name, but not the rules that would soon erase his authority. I walked past familiar faces without explanation, carrying a box that felt lighter than it should have. The unfairness burned, not loud but constant. A pressure behind my eyes. I wanted to shout, to correct the record, to force the truth back into place. Instead, I kept moving. Let them believe the story they were given. Let them think silence meant weakness. I knew better. The company was still operating on rules they had forgotten, and injustice, when documented carefully, has a way of turning into something far more dangerous than they ever expected before. Celebration echoed through the floor, above mine. Muted laughter and clinking glasses drifting down the hallway as if nothing had happened. The CEO wasted no time filling the vacuum. He announced an interim replacement, praised decisive leadership, and accepted congratulations like trophies he believed were long overdue today. I sat alone in a borrowed conference room, the kind no one schedules unless they want privacy. My badge was gone, my inbox empty, yet the building still hummed around me. That disconnect stirred suspicion. A quiet question pressing harder with every passing minute inside my own head. I opened the company charter on my laptop, not out of hope, but habit. I had lived inside those pages during mergers, restructurings, and board standoffs. Reading it again felt procedural, almost mechanical, until one clause slowed my breathing without announcing itself to me. Quietly, deliberately, and completely. The language was plain, unambiguous, and inconvenient for anyone acting on impulse. Termination authority for a controlling shareholder or designated executive required board action, documented votes, and legal review. None of that had happened. The CEO's confidence suddenly looked less like power and more like ignorance exposed publicly. I felt no rush of triumph, only restraint tightening in my chest. If I reacted now, emotion would blur the edges of something precise. So I did nothing dramatic. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't forward the clause. I simply kept reading, letting doubt sharpen into certainty slowly. The termination letter sat in my files, bearing the CEO's signature in bold confidence. He had signed it himself, without counsel, without oversight. That name, placed too easily on the page, transformed the document from an insult into evidence. I saved it twice, in two separate locations securely. Outside, the company celebrated momentum it didn't understand. Inside, I measured timing. There was no advantage in speed, only accuracy. The injustice still burned, but it had shifted shape. It was no longer noise, it was pressure, focused and patient, waiting for the right release to arrive naturally. I drafted no speeches and rehearsed no arguments. The system mattered more than my voice. One clean question would travel further than anger ever could. I opened a new email, addressed it to legal, and stared at the cursor until restraint steadied my hands completely at last again. The message itself was brief, almost polite, stripped of accusation or context. I asked only what needed answering, nothing more. Sending it felt anticlimactic, yet decisive. Doubt lingered, but beneath it ran a calm certainty that the rules were about to speak for me without my help whatsoever. When I hit send, nothing visibly changed. And that was the point. Celebration continued upstairs. Unchecked and unaware, I closed the laptop and waited, containing everything I wanted to say. Silence settled in, not as defeat, but as preparation for consequences that would arrive soon enough thereafter quietly. The next paragraph has a hidden detail that only a sharp person can catch. Legal silence is never empty. It is deliberate, measured, and usually dangerous for someone. After I sent the email, nothing happened. No acknowledgement, no request for clarification. Legal didn't ask HR for context or copy the CEO for cover. They simply opened the file. I knew that because the document timestamp changed, quietly, without ceremony. Someone was reading carefully. Hours passed. The CEO continued celebrating his authority, announcing appointments, forwarding praise, projecting confidence. He expected resistance, maybe even panic. Instead, he received nothing, no confirmation, no approval, no validation. Silence followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. I remained terminated on paper. My access stayed locked. Security still treated me as a risk rather than a contributor. On the surface, nothing had improved. That stability told me everything. Systems don't reverse loudly. They realign when the right pressure is applied in the right place. Legal worked methodically. They reviewed the charter, the termination letter, the authority chain. They checked board minutes that didn't exist and approvals that were never granted. Each missing piece made the picture clearer. The CEO had acted alone, decisively, and incorrectly. What struck me wasn't speed, but restraint. Legal could have pushed back immediately. They didn't. They needed leverage, not noise. Every unanswered hour widened the gap between perception and reality. The CEO still believed he was in control. Control, however, requires recognition. He wasn't getting any. I watched the internal calendar quietly shift. Meetings were postponed, conversations delayed, people hesitated before acting. Uncertainty crept in where certainty had been declared. That's how systems correct errors, not with confrontation, but with friction. Late in the afternoon, the first sign appeared, not to the CEO, not to me. It surfaced internally, routed through channels that didn't ask permission. An email flagged for executive review circulated quietly among departments that mattered. We need an emergency board review. That was it. No explanation, no accusation. Just a procedural sentence with consequences attached. The system had acknowledged the breach without announcing the culprit. That restraint confirmed everything. The CEO still hadn't heard a word. His authority remained technically intact, yet practically suspended by hesitation and protocol. I was still dismissed, still waiting, still silent. But the direction had changed. Cold clarity settled in. I hadn't regained power. I hadn't demanded justice. I had simply asked a question and let the structure answer honestly. Control, I realized, isn't about being loud. It's about knowing where pressure travels and trusting it to reach the right destination. By the time the board assembled, the outcome would feel inevitable, not because I pushed it forward, but because the rules had finally been forced to speak. When the board convened, the temperature of the company changed instantly. This wasn't a scheduled meeting or a ceremonial update. Directors joined from offices, cars, and airports, faces tight, voices clipped, urgency replaced confidence, and no one bothered pretending otherwise. I wasn't invited into the room. That absence was intentional. Board matters moved faster without witnesses, and today, speed mattered. From where I waited, I could still feel the shift. Messages stopped mid-sentence, calendars froze, power paused. The company's outside counsel spoke first. She didn't soften her tone or waste language. She stated the facts as if reading weather data. The termination issued by the CEO was invalid. It violated the company charter. It bypassed required board authority. Each sentence landed harder than the last. Then she went further. By acting unilaterally, the CEO had breached his fiduciary duty, not emotionally, not hypothetically, legally. That word carried weight no apology could offset. The CEO interrupted immediately. He argued necessity. He argued urgency. He blamed HR for processing paperwork without escalation. He framed the situation as operational efficiency gone wrong. The room let him speak, then moved on without responding. HR said nothing, not a defense, not an explanation. Silence confirmed what argument could not. Procedures had been followed under instruction. Responsibility sat exactly where the signature sat. For the first time, the CEO's authority looked fragile. He was still seated at the head of the table, yet no one deferred to him. Directors asked questions he couldn't answer. Counsel referenced obligations he couldn't deny. Momentum shifted without asking permission. I felt the reversal before it reached me. Control doesn't announce itself. It withdraws. The CEO's voice lost rhythm. His certainty cracked. He realized too late that confidence wasn't power if the system refused to recognize it. The decision followed swiftly, until further review. The CEO's signing authority was suspended. Temporary, procedural, unavoidable, no drama, no vote tallies shared aloud, just a quiet transfer of control away from the man who assumed it belonged to him. The irony was surgical. I remained terminated on paper, yet the man who fired me could no longer authorize anything at all. Titles stayed the same. Reality did not. When the meeting ended, the company didn't celebrate. It recalibrated. I stood alone, steady, watching an imbalance correct itself. This wasn't revenge. It was structure reclaiming ground it had briefly lost. I didn't smile or speak. I simply waited, understanding that authority rarely collapses loudly. It shrinks, retreats, and leaves space behind. That space was opening now, measurable and real. Others would step carefully into it soon, for the first time since the boardroom dismissal. I felt neither anger nor relief, only control returning, piece by piece, without asking my permission. It was enough to know the reversal had begun, and it would not stop until the structure finished correcting the damage done by arrogance alone. You will want to stay until the end to hear this part. When authority slips, it rarely disappears quietly. It lashes out. The CEO didn't retreat after the board decision. He escalated. Emails began circulating that questioned my competence, my motives, my loyalty. He framed himself as a victim of internal sabotage, hinted that my removal was necessary to protect the company from instability. Each message carried the same undertone: this was my fault. Then came the legal threats. He told anyone who would listen that I would be sued for breach, for defamation, for damages that existed only in his imagination. He wanted fear to do what authority no longer could. Pressure replaced command. I said nothing, not publicly, not privately. Silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was insulation. Every accusation he made created another record. Every threat expanded the paper trail he didn't realize he was writing. Legal moved again. This time, less quietly. They produced emails showing instructions sent directly from the CEO to HR. Bypassing required review. They documented verbal orders delivered in meetings where no counsel was present. They outlined a pattern of unilateral decisions justified as urgency and executed as control. The picture sharpened with each file. The CEO pushed back harder. He denied intent. He denied memory. He denied responsibility. He argued that leadership required speed, that procedure slowed innovation, that exceptions were necessary. None of it addressed authority. None of it erased signatures. Tension filled every corridor. Executives hesitated before acting, unsure which approvals still carried weight. Meetings ended without conclusions. Projects stalled. The company felt stretched between assertion and reality. I watched from a distance, deliberately uninvolved. My absence frustrated him more than confrontation ever would. He wanted a fight. He wanted noise. Instead, he faced documentation. When the board reconvened, their tone had changed. This was no longer about a single termination. Council recommended a broader review. The risk wasn't isolated, it was systemic. The decision landed cleanly. The board ordered a full evaluation of every executive action taken by the CEO over the previous 6 months. Contracts, terminations, appointments, communications, nothing exempt. That directive shifted the balance completely. The CEO's campaign stalled mid-sentence. Retaliation requires credibility, and scrutiny destroys it. He had fought back with volume and threats. The system responded with scope and time. I remained silent, exactly where I needed to be. Control no longer depended on my participation. It had moved beyond personalities into process. Where resistance only accelerates collapse, the fight wasn't over, but its direction was decided. I understood then that his resistance was predictable, almost procedural, driven by ego rather than strategy. Every attempt to regain ground exposed another weakness, another decision made without authority. The more he struggled, the tighter the structure closed around him. I didn't need to act. Time, review, and process were already moving, steadily, toward an outcome he could no longer influence. That truth settled quietly, irreversible and final for him. Collapse rarely announces itself. It reveals patterns. Once the board authorized the 6-month review, the chain reaction began. Decision after decision unraveled under basic scrutiny. Appointments the CEO rushed through without vetting suddenly looked indefensible. Executives he promoted lacked credentials, experience, or approval. Each discovery tightened the pressure. Contracts he had celebrated as breakthroughs drew immediate attention. Terms were vague, oversight missing, risk pushed forward without disclosure. Legal flagged conflicts, finance flagged exposure, compliance flagged silence. The same confidence that once impressed now alarmed investors. Shareholders demanded explanations that never arrived. The CEO tried to reassure them with optimism and speed. They wanted accountability, not enthusiasm, one by one. His allies stepped back. Board members who once deferred now questioned every assumption. Senior managers stopped defending decisions they hadn't made. Isolation followed authority like a shadow. I observed the collapse without satisfaction, only clarity. This wasn't chaos, it was consequence. Every shortcut he took returned as a liability. The louder he defended himself, the more credibility drained away. Then the call came. Not to the CEO, not to the board. The bank contacted me. They needed confirmation regarding control and authorization. The review had triggered a routine safeguard buried deep in our agreements. Leadership uncertainty required verification, I answered calmly, providing only what was requested. No commentary, no leverage, no emotion. The call ended politely. Its impact did not. When the CEO learned the bank had bypassed him, something fundamental shifted. Authority relies on recognition. He no longer had it. The collapse accelerated, methodical and irreversible. What he touched failed, because it was never truly his to command. I remained still as the structure corrected itself. Satisfaction didn't come from victory, but from watching order return. The chain reaction continued, indifferent to ego. Each report, each audit note, each withheld approval narrowed his options. Resistance became futile precisely because it was recorded. The company no longer reacted to him, it reacted around him. I understood then how collapses truly happen. They begin with confidence, pass through scrutiny, and end with silence. The satisfaction was quiet, controlled, and complete. Nothing dramatic remained to be done. The system was finishing the work for me. All I had to do was wait and observe the final adjustments. Every hour stripped away another illusion of control. The CEO's influence shrank with each unanswered question. Stakeholders saw patterns, not explanations. Trust moved elsewhere, decisively. I felt no need to intervene or correct the narrative. The narrative was correcting itself. That was the most effective form of collapse. It required no anger, no speeches, and no confrontation. It required only time, records, and accountability. The chain reaction had moved beyond stopping. Everything he touched kept failing, quietly and completely. I watched without interruption, knowing this phase was irreversible. The collapse no longer needed my presence to continue. It was already happening everywhere that mattered most inside. They didn't fire him, and that decision hurt more than dismissal ever could. The board announced it without ceremony, framing it as temporary continuity. The CEO would remain in his role, but stripped of everything that defined authority. No signature power, no public statements, no strategic decisions. He stayed, officially. While control moved quietly around him, I watched the announcement land across departments like cold fog. Employees understood immediately what it meant. Titles can survive without power, but dignity cannot. The CEO returned to meetings he could not lead. He sat at the table while others spoke past him. Questions bypassed him and landed on interim approvals. Decisions were recorded without his input. He nodded, smiled tightly, and took notes no one would read. This was not exile. It was exposure. Remaining meant witnessing his relevance evaporate in real time. Leaving would have preserved illusion, staying forced understanding. I felt no satisfaction yet, only a cold symmetry settling in. He had dismissed me publicly, now he was diminished privately. The building treated him like a fixed object to walk around. Then came the final instruction. The board requested he brief his successor personally, not as mentorship, but as transfer. He was required to explain decisions he could no longer defend. Watching that request land on him was brutal. Humiliation doesn't shout, it instructs. He understood then what power truly was. It wasn't the title, or the office, or the nameplate. It was recognition, and he no longer had it. I remained silent, distant, observing the final stage. He stayed because he had no exit that preserved pride. That was the punishment. Cold rooms teach lessons faster than confrontations ever do. I knew the story was nearing its end, but not yet finished. There was still one role left for him to play. It would be quieter than any firing. It would last longer, and it would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. The system had chosen restraint over spectacle. That restraint made the humiliation complete. I didn't need justice announced. I watched it unfold in silence. The message was clear to everyone involved. Power does not vanish, it relocates, and this time, it had moved away from him permanently. The halls felt colder, quieter, and more deliberate than before. People adjusted their behavior without being told. That adjustment marked the true end of his control. No announcement could have done that. Only staying could. I turned away knowing the structure would finish correcting itself. What remained for him was instruction without authority. That imbalance was irreversible. The coldness lingered long after meetings ended. Shame works best when it is procedural. He would carry it longer than any termination notice. I walked on, certain the lesson was complete. Staying had broken him more cleanly than leaving ever could. That truth settled heavily across the company. No one questioned it. Afterward, justice rarely arrives with applause. It comes quietly, settles in, and leaves nothing to argue with afterward. The CEO submitted his resignation early in the morning. Before most people arrived, no speech, no farewell message, no dramatic explanation. The board accepted it without comment. There was no press release, no celebratory email, no attempt to rewrite the ending. Silence handled it better than announcements ever could. By midday, the truth began circulating anyway, not through official channels, but through conversations, glances, and confirmations whispered between meetings. People compared notes, timelines aligned. The story the CEO had written about my departure collapsed under its own weight. Facts replaced rumors, and clarity spread faster than damage control ever does. Legal restored my name in the records. Internal documents were corrected. Projects I had led were reattributed without fanfare. No apology was issued, and none was required. Restoration doesn't need emotion, it needs accuracy. That was enough. Employees stopped avoiding my gaze. Some nodded, some smiled faintly. Others simply looked relieved, as if a tension they hadn't named had finally released. Justice doesn't demand gratitude. It settles accounts and moves on. The board offered my position back formally. Same title, same authority, same compensation. It was framed as continuity, as correction, as fairness. I listened, thanked them, and declined. The room paused, surprised by the refusal. I didn't need the role to validate what had already been resolved. My reputation was intact. My work had spoken. Taking the position again would have looked like closure, but it wasn't the kind I wanted. Justice had already done its job. Word spread quickly. The refusal landed harder than any acceptance could have. It made the outcome final. People understood that this wasn't about winning back a seat. It was about proving the system still worked when pushed correctly. I walked through the building one last time without escort or permission. Nothing needed to be reclaimed. The weight was gone. What remained was balance. The company moved forward without noise. Leadership adjusted, processes tightened, memory did the rest. I left knowing no statement would ever explain this moment better than the quiet understanding now shared by everyone who witnessed it. Justice doesn't shout. It concludes. And when it does, it leaves space for something cleaner to begin. That clarity followed me outside the building, steady and calm. I felt lighter not because I had won, but because the truth no longer needed defense. People would remember this quietly, as an example. Not a scandal. I didn't look back. The resolution didn't require witnessing. It required distance. Justice had closed the account completely, leaving no debt, no argument, and no need for return. Some endings demand celebration. This one demanded respect, and it had finally earned it. Walking away felt right, measured, and final, because nothing remained unfinished, unresolved, or unspoken, and that quiet completeness mattered more than any title ever could have offered to me before. I entered the boardroom without announcement, not as an executive, not as an employee, but as a controlling shareholder holding 71% of the company. No one asked me to sit. They already knew why I was there. Papers were aligned, seats were filled, the atmosphere was calm, surgical, and resolved. The former CEO was present, quieter than I had ever seen him. For weeks he had stayed, diminished and constrained, watching authority operate without him. Now he finally understood the full shape of his mistake. He had never possessed the power he believed he wielded. He had borrowed it, misused it, and recorded the evidence himself. The chair acknowledged my ownership formally. Numbers replaced titles, percentages replaced opinions. With that, the meeting moved forward efficiently. Decisions were ratified, controls were reassigned. The company stabilized in ways that felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had happened. I spoke once, briefly, not to accuse, not to revisit damage. I clarified structure, affirmed continuity, and closed the loop that had been left open deliberately. There was no applause, no tension left to release. The system had already accepted the outcome. The former CEO looked at me then, not with anger, but recognition. It arrived late, but complete. For the first time, he understood that firing me had never been an act of authority. It had been a confession. I met his eyes and delivered the only conclusion this story required. You didn't fire me. You documented yourself. No response followed. None was necessary. The record spoke louder than any defense could. The meeting adjourned cleanly. People stood, collected their materials, and moved forward without commentary. As I left the room, I felt no triumph surge, no hunger for acknowledgement. Victory didn't feel sharp, it felt balanced. Justice had arrived without spectacle, enforced by rules everyone had agreed to long before this moment. Outside, the building continued its rhythm, work resumed, calls were made, life carried on. That was the final confirmation. The outcome didn't disrupt the system, it restored it. I walked away with nothing to reclaim and nothing to prove. Control was no longer contested, it simply existed where it always should have, silent, absolute, and settled. That quiet resolution mattered more than recognition, promotions, or headlines, because it confirmed something deeper when systems are respected. Justice arrives calmly, conclusively, and without needing permission from anyone watching in the end today. Listening back to this story, I'm reminded that real power isn't loud, it's patient, structured, and rooted in knowing your ground. Sometimes the strongest response is restraint, letting truth surface on its own terms. How did this story make you feel? Was there a moment or detail that stayed with you longer than the rest? I'd genuinely love to know where you're listening from right now. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments, give the video a like, pass it along to someone who might need it, and subscribe so we can keep exploring stories like this together.